Hi students, I am Praveen Sebastian Paul. In this lecture, we are discussing the different disaster risk management techniques as well as the different definitions or terminologies for disaster management. When a hazard event such as drought, flood, cyclone, earthquake or tsunamis occurs, triggering a loss of life and damage to the infrastructure, it highlights the reality that society and its assets are vulnerable to such events. When discussing disasters risk management, a disaster can highlight the following in a community. The first one is the geographical area where the community is settled is exposed to such a hazard, as well as the society, including the individuals and its infrastructure, assets, and other processes, as well as services which may have experienced damage or destructions, are known as the vulnerability of that particular disaster. The different terminologies in disaster management system are as follows. The first one is a disaster risk. A disaster risk is defined as the potential loss of life, injury, or destroy or damage assets which could occur to a system, society, or a community in a specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, and capacity. In the technical sense, it is defined through the combination of three terms: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. The second term is hazard. Hazard is defined as a process, phenomenon, or human activity that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social and economical disruptions, or environmental degradation. Hazards may be single, sequential, or combined in their origin and effects. Each hazard is characterized by its location, intensity or magnitude, frequency, and probability. The third one is the exposure. Exposure is defined as the situation of people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard-prone areas. Measures of exposure can include the number of people or type of asset in an area. These can be combined with specific vulnerability and capacity of the exposed elements to any particular hazard to estimate the quantitative risk associated with that hazard in the area of interest. The next term is the vulnerability. Vulnerability is defined as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or system to impacts of hazards. Vulnerability is multi-dimensional in its nature, and it includes cultural and institutional factors. The different examples include poor design and construction of buildings, inadequate protection of assets, lack of public information and awareness, high level of poverty and education, limited official recognition of risk and preparedness measures, disregard of wise environmental management, or weak institutions and governance, which include corruptions too. The next term is the disaster risk reduction. The disaster risk reduction is aimed to preventing new and reducing existing risk and managing residual risk, all of which contribute to strengthening resilience and therefore to the achievement of sustainable development. Disaster risk reduction is the policy objective of disaster risk management, and its goal and objectives are defined in disaster risk reduction strategies and plans. Disaster risk reduction strategies and policies define goal and objectives across different timescales with concrete targets, indicators, and timeframes. The another term is the disaster risk management. A disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reduce the existing disaster risk, and manage residual risk, contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of losses. Disaster risk management actions can be categorized into prospective disaster risk management, corrective disaster risk management, and compensatory risk disaster management. Another term is the information management in disaster risk reduction. In the recent years, researchers and experts have been developing methods to conduct assessment of hazard, vulnerability, and coping capacities, as well as techniques to combine such assessments in order to present them in a risk map format. Such maps are essential in developing strategies to reduce the level of existing risk and as a way to avoid a generation of new risk due to underlying social and economical risk drivers. So these are different terminologies in disaster management system, and when we come to the disaster resilience topic, the disaster resilience is the ability of the individuals, communities, organizations and state to adapt and to recover from hazards, shocks or stress without compromising long-term prospects for development. Disaster resilience is determined by the degree to which individual communities and public and private organizations are capable of organizing themselves to learn from past disasters and reduce their risk in future ones at international, regional, national and local levels. The core elements of disaster resilience are context, disturbance, capacity to respond, and finally the reaction. When we come to the context factor, context is whose resilience is being built, such as a social group, socio-economical or political system, environmental context or institutions. The disturbance is what shocks and stresses the group aim to resilient to. These shocks includes sudden events like conflicts or disasters, and stresses include long-term trends like resource degradation, urbanization or climate changes. The capacity to respond is the ability of a system or process to deal with a shock or stress depending upon the exposure, sensitivity and the adaptive capacity of that particular disaster management system. The exposure includes the magnitude of shock or stress. The sensitivity includes the degree to which a system can be affected by or will respond to a given shock or a stress, and the adaptive capacity includes how well it can adjust to a disturbance or moderate damage, take advantage of opportunities and cope with the consequences of a transformation. And the final one is the reaction. A range of responses are possible, which includes bounce back better, where capacities are enhanced, exposures are reduced, and the system is more able to deal with the future shocks and stresses, bounce back where pre-existing conditions prevail, or recover but worse than before capacities are reduced. In the worst case scenario, the system collapses, leading to a catastrophic reduction in capacity to cope with the future. So these are the different strategies or terms or terminologies in disaster management. So disaster management means when a hazard event occurs, triggering a loss of life or damage to infrastructure, it highlights the reality that the society and its assets are vulnerable to such events. And when discussing the disaster risk management, the disaster can highlight the hazard as well as the vulnerability occurred due to that particular disaster. So my dear students, kindly go through this assignment question. The question is, define the following. First one is disaster risk, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, information management, and finally disaster resilience. So dear students, in the upcoming lecture we will discuss earthquake, its features, its occurrence, its causes and its effects. So see you soon. Until then, goodbye. Thank you and all the best.